When Princess Anne proposed passing the Spencer tiara, a symbol of Princess Diana, to Charlotte, she didn't anticipate it would unleash a storm within the royal family. William, Catherine, Charles Spencer, and even Harry each carries a memory, a perspective, and an unhealed wound. But in this undeclared war, two little girls, Charlotte and Lilibet, are caught between royal pressures and public expectations. The tiara is no longer just a piece of jewelry. It's a question who has the right to carry Diana's spirit. The morning of June 2025 bathed London in rare sunlight. Buckingham Palace stood resolute in the square, the royal standard fluttering proudly. The color ceremony, marking the king's official birthday, unfolded with flawless precision. Scarlet-clad troops marched, hooves clattered, and the crowd cheered below the balcony. But above, amid meticulously rehearsed smiles, an invisible crack was spreading through the heart of the royal family. Princess Anne, her sharp features and piercing gaze missing nothing, stood slightly back. Her navy ensemble exuded severity, as if she were not just a royal, but the keeper of its secrets. Her eyes scanned the balcony, King Charles, his smile weary and hands faintly trembling. William, shoulders rigid in his ceremonial uniform, eyes betraying tension. Catherine, radiant in an elegant white dress, but her clasped hands betraying an effort to suppress something. Harry and Meghan, as usual, were absent far away in California, detached from the palace's glamour and whispers. Anne tilted her head, her gaze settling on Charlotte, the 8-year-old standing beside her mother. In a pale blue dress, her blonde hair neatly tied, Charlotte's wide eyes observed everything with unguarded curiosity. Something about her made Anne pause. The composure, the confidence, and above all a spark reminiscent of Diana, the sister-in-law Anne both admired and found enigmatic. Charlotte wasn't just a young princess. She was a promise, a flame waiting to be kindled. The ceremony ended with applause and photographs beamed worldwide. The royals retreated inside Buckingham Palace, where the air grew heavier. In a small drawing room where Persian rugs and portraits of past monarchs created a stifling atmosphere, Anne requested a private meeting with William and Catherine. No guards, no secretaries, just the three of them. William sat in an armchair, hands clasped, exhaustion in his eyes. The morning had been long, filled with rituals and press questions about his father's health. Rumors of King Charles's illness were spreading, despite the palace's firm denials. Catherine sat beside him, hands resting lightly on her knees, her gentle smile masking sharp alertness. She knew Anne never summoned them for idle chat. "We need to talk about the future." Anne began, her voice low and resolute, like a general issuing orders. Not the throne, not Charles or William, but Charlotte. William frowned, surprised. "Charlotte. She's only 8, Anne." "Indeed," Anne replied, her gaze unwavering. "But she's no ordinary child. She's Diana's granddaughter, your daughter, and the only one in this generation who carries both my strength and your mother's light." Catherine leaned forward, her hands tightening. She sensed something momentous was coming, but her maternal heart stirred with vague unease. "What do you mean, ma'am?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. Anne rose, stepping to the window, her eyes on the gardens beyond. "I've watched Charlotte for some time. She has the composure, the confidence, and the sensitivity I saw in myself as a young woman. But more than that, she has Diana's heart. I want her prepared not just to be a princess, but a symbol. The title of Princess Royal Mine should pass to Charlotte when the time comes. And beyond that," she turned, her eyes icy, "the Spencer tiara, it should be hers." Silence enveloped the room. William felt his heart constrict. The Spencer tiara, the legendary jewel that once adorned his mother's golden hair, a symbol of the Spencer family and of wounds that never healed. It belonged not to the royals, but to his uncle, Earl Charles Spencer. Anne's mention of it with the intent to give it to Charlotte was a bold declaration, almost shattering unwritten rules. "Charlotte's too young," William said, his voice low but firm. "We can't place that kind of pressure on her. She's not my mother." Catherine touched William's arm, a gentle but steady gesture. "But what if it's a way to preserve Diana's legacy, William?" She said, her voice soft yet weighty. "Charlotte doesn't need to become Diana. She can be herself, but carry her spirit, a spirit the world still craves." Anne nodded, her gaze softening but unyielding. "She won't just be a princess, William. She'll be a woman who leads like me, like Diana tried to be. But to do that, she needs preparation. And the Spencer tiara will be the symbol of that path. William fell silent, his eyes lost in the distance. He remembered his mother, her radiant smile, her sorrowful eyes, the way she hugged him tightly, as if shielding him from the world. Charlotte had that smile, those eyes. But he didn't want his daughter to bear the immense shadow of her grandmother. Catherine looked at her husband, her heart torn between pride in her daughter's recognition and fear of what the future might hold. She thought of Charlotte, the girl who loved painting, running in the garden, and asking innocent questions about the grandmother she never met. Was she ready for such a legacy? "We'll consider it," Catherine finally said, her voice both gentle and resolute. "But everything must be for Charlotte's sake, not anyone else's." Anne smiled a rare, meaningful smile. "Good. But remember, time waits for no one, not even royalty." As William and Catherine left the room, they said nothing to each other, but both felt an invisible shift. On the balcony, Charlotte still stood waving to the crowd, her smile as bright as the sun. But in her eyes was a spark only Anne recognized, the spark of a woman who would shape the future, though the path ahead was fraught with challenges. Dusk fell over Althorp, the ancient Spencer family estate, where endless green fields and rows of oaks whispered centuries-old tales. In the study, Earl Charles Spencer sat alone, his somber gaze fixed on a black ebony box on the desk. Inside was the Spencer tiara, the jewel that once graced his sister Diana's golden hair on her fateful wedding day in 1981. Its diamonds sparkled under the lamplight, but to Charles they were more than gems. They were memories, pain, and a reminder of a promise never fulfilled. Charles lightly touched the tiara, his fingers tracing its intricate engravings. He remembered Diana, her radiant smile, her eyes always tinged with indescribable sadness, the times she hugged him tightly, as if reassuring him everything would be all right. But nothing was all right. Diana was gone, leaving behind a fractured family and a legacy the world still debated. The tiara, though owned by the Spencers, had become Diana's symbol, not just a princess, but the Queen of Hearts. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The butler entered, his voice low. "Sir Prince William and Princess Anne have arrived." Charles frowned, unease rising. He knew why they were here. Anne's call the previous week had been clear. She wanted to discuss Charlotte, the tiara, and a future Charles wasn't ready to face. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and signaled for the butler to show them in. William entered the study, his eyes scanning the ancient bookshelves and the portrait of Diana on the wall. The painting showed her in a green silk dress, her smile gentle, but her eyes piercing, as if seeing through to the soul. William's heart tightened. Nearly 30 years after his mother's death, her image still felt like losing a piece of himself. Anne walked beside him, her demeanor as composed as ever. In a gray coat, her silver hair neatly tied, her sharp eyes swept the room. To Anne, Althorp wasn't just the Spencer home. It was a repository of Diana's memories, the woman who briefly forced the monarchy to change. "Charles," Anne said, her voice polite, yet unyielding. "Thank you for seeing us." Charles nodded, gesturing for them to sit. He wasn't one for pleasantries. "I assume this isn't a social visit," he said, his gaze resting on William. "Go on, what's this about?" Charlotte. William took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He'd reflected deeply since his talk with Anne at Buckingham Palace. The idea of giving Charlotte the Spencer tiara wasn't just symbolic. It was a proclamation, a way to tie his daughter to her grandmother's legacy. But he also knew for Charles the tiara wasn't mere jewelry. It was Diana's blood and tears. "Uncle Charles," William began, his voice low but sincere. "We want to discuss passing the Spencer tiara to Charlotte. Not now, but when she's older. It's not just a piece of jewelry. It's a symbol of my mother, of the love, compassion, and strength she left behind. Charlotte, she has those qualities." Charles was silent, his eyes shifting to the tiara on the desk. A quiet anger simmered, not at William, but at a world that had turned Diana into an icon, stealing her humanity. "You're right," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "It's not just jewelry. It's Diana. It's the years she struggled, the tears she hid behind her smile. And you want me to give it to Charlotte, an 8-year-old who only knows her through stories?" Anne leaned forward, her eyes locked on Charles. "We're not talking about giving it to her today, Charles. But Charlotte isn't an ordinary girl. She's Diana's granddaughter, and she carries her spirit. This tiara shouldn't stay locked in a vault. It should live worn by a woman who will carry Diana's legacy forward, not as a copy, but as a new flame. Charles gave a bitter laugh. Diana's legacy. And you of all people know the monarchy never truly valued it. They loved her shadow, but feared her truth. And now you want to place that shadow on a child's shoulders. William felt his blood rise. He loved his uncle, but Charles's words cut like a knife reopening old wounds. I don't want Charlotte to become my mother, he said, his voice firmer. I want her to be herself. But she's also part of Mum, and I believe Mum would want her to wear this tiara, not for the monarchy, but for what she stood for, love, kindness, and a woman's right to be strong. The room fell silent. Charles looked at William, then Anne, and finally back at the tiara. He remembered Diana's late-night calls, her trembling voice recounting palace pressures. He'd promised to protect her, but he'd failed. Now he faced another promise to the next generation. I need time, Charles said at last, his voice heavy. This tiara isn't just mine. It's Diana's, and I can't give it away without being sure it won't burden Charlotte. She deserves to choose her own fate, not be forced by her grandmother's legacy. Anne nodded, her gaze softening but resolute. We respect that, Charles. But remember, time favors no one. Charlotte will grow up, and the world won't wait. William stood, his eyes lingering on his mother's portrait. He felt an invisible connection to Diana, as if she were watching, faintly smiling. Thank you, Uncle, he said, his voice soft but determined. I hope one day you'll see Charlotte as I do, not just Mum's granddaughter, but someone who will carry her spirit further. As William and Anne left Althorp, the moon hung in the sky. Charles remained in the study, his hand still clutching the tiara. He thought of Diana, of Charlotte, of unhealed wounds. Deciding whether to pass on the tiara wasn't just a family matter. It was a question of whether he could let go of the past, and he had no answer yet. California's sun blazed, casting golden light over the garden behind Harry and Meghan's modern Montecito home. Lilibet, the 4-year-old with curly brown hair and wide eyes, sat on the grass, clutching a crayon and scribbling flowers on paper. Beside her, Meghan leaned down, her smile gentle, but her eyes ever watchful, as if shielding Lilibet from the world. Birds chirped, blending with Lilibet's giggles, creating a peaceful scene, a world far from Buckingham Palace's stifling protocols. Lily, what are you drawing? Meghan asked, stroking her daughter's hair. A garden, Mommy. Lilibet replied, her voice clear. Like the one Grandma had. You told me. Meghan froze, her smile briefly fading. She'd shared carefully curated stories about Diana, a woman who loved flowers, children, and making the world better. But she omitted the pain, the hounding cameras, the towering shadow Diana left. To Lilibet, Diana was an imagined grandmother, built from her mother's love. Yet Meghan knew the name Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor was more than a name. It was a declaration tying her daughter to a legacy she couldn't yet grasp. Thousands of miles away in London, Charlotte was entering a world Lilibet would never know. The Chelsea Flower Show, a beloved royal event, buzzed with life. Vibrant flower displays, classic English roses to exotic orchids, formed a living tapestry. Charlotte, in a white dress with blue floral accents, walked beside Catherine, her tiny shoes tapping the gravel path. The crowd watched her, whispers rippling. Look, she's so like Diana. Catherine held Charlotte's hand, her eyes proud yet anxious. This was Charlotte's first official event as an individual, not just Prince William's daughter. Tasked with chatting to local school children, it was a challenge even adults might find daunting. But Charlotte, with surprising confidence, stepped forward, her smile as bright as the sun. Hi, everyone, she said, her voice clear and unafraid. What's your favorite flower? A shy boy raised his hand. Sunflowers, Princess. They're big and bright. Charlotte nodded, her eyes sparkling. I love sunflowers too. My grandma planted them, Mummy says. They always face the sun like they're smiling. The crowd murmured, reporters scribbling furiously. Catherine, standing nearby, felt her heart race. Charlotte hadn't just mentioned Diana naturally. She carried the warmth and connection Diana had with people. But Catherine also felt a gnawing worry. The world saw Charlotte, but they also saw another figure, one Catherine wasn't sure she wanted her daughter to bear. That night in London, Charlotte lay in bed clutching her favorite teddy bear. She thought of the day, the flowers, the smiles, the strange looks from adults. She didn't fully understand, but she sensed something big awaited. In her dreams, she saw a blonde woman in a green dress standing in a sunflower garden, smiling and waving as if saying, "You'll be okay?" Meanwhile, in California, Lilibet slept soundly, her hand still gripping a crayon. In her dreams, another garden bloomed, where flowers never wilted, and a gentle voice whispered, "You are my light." Two girls, two destinies, two worlds. But both carried a flame, the flame of a woman the world never forgot. A thin fog cloaked London's night, dimming the golden lights of Kensington Palace. In his private office, William sat at his desk, the desk lamp highlighting new lines around his eyes. Before him was a phone, its screen displaying a familiar international number, Harry's. He'd hesitated for an hour, his finger hovering over the call button, his heart heavy with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Finally, he pressed it. The rings echoed, each one a heartbeat. In Montecito, Harry answered, his voice low and tired. "Well, it's late there, isn't it?" "Yeah," William replied, striving for calm. "But I need to talk. About Charlotte. And about Mum." Silence stretched on the other end. William could picture Harry in his modern California home, perhaps, by a window overlooking the garden where Lilibet played. He knew Harry disliked these calls, ones that dredged up the past when they were close brothers, sharing the pain of losing their mother before everything shattered. "Charlotte, huh?" Harry said at last, his voice tinged with frost. "I've read the papers. Chelsea Flower Show articles comparing her to Mum. And now the Spencer tiara, right?" William's grip tightened, feeling stung. He wasn't surprised. Harry knew news traveled fast, and Meghan was adept at tracking what the media said about the royals. But Harry's tone, the bitterness in every word, felt like an impassable wall. "Harry, it's not as simple as the papers make it," William said, trying to stay calm. "Aunt Anne and Uncle Charles are discussing giving Charlotte the tiara, not now, but when she's older. It's not just jewelry. It's part of Mum and Charlotte. She carries Mum's spirit." Harry laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "Mum's spirit? Will you think I don't get that Lilibet's her granddaughter too? She carries her name and she has just as much right to that legacy. But you and the royals, you've never considered that, have you?" Harry's words were a blaze burning away William's fragile hope. He wanted to explain, to say this wasn't about excluding Lilibet, that he only wanted to honor their mother's legacy in the way he thought right. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, his voice harder, "Harry, you're turning this into a war. Charlotte isn't Lilibet's enemy. They're cousins, for God's sake. I just want what's best for her and for Mum." "What's best?" Harry interrupted, his voice rising, trembling with anger. "What's best for Mum is letting her rest, Will. Not dragging her into royal stories, forcing kids like Charlotte or Lilibet to live in her shadow. You think Mum would want that tiara in exchange for their freedom?" William's blood surged. He wanted to shout, to say Harry had no right to judge, that Harry had abandoned the monarchy, abandoned him, leaving him to carry everything alone. But he restrained himself, taking a deep breath. "Harry," he said, his voice low but heavy, "I'm not forcing Charlotte, and I'd never want Lilibet forgotten. But the Spencer tiara belongs to the Spencers, and Uncle Charles will decide. If you have an opinion, talk to him." Harry fell silent, but William could sense the storm in his brother's heart. Finally, Harry said, his voice hoarse, "I will. But Will, if you think this will bring peace, you're wrong. Mum's shadow never brings peace. It only brings pain." The call ended in silence, no goodbyes, just the weight of unresolved pain. William sat staring at the darkened phone screen, feeling as if he'd lost another piece of himself. He thought of his mother, her hugs enveloping both brothers, whispering they'd always be a team. But that team was broken, and the Spencer tiara, meant to symbolize love, had become the spark of a silent battle. Kensington Palace was bathed in the dim glow of a July afternoon, raindrops pattering softly outside. In a private sitting room, Catherine sat in an armchair, a cold teacup on the table before her. Across from her was Princess Anne, as poised as ever, though her eyes held a rare trace of fatigue. On the table lay a fresh newspaper, its front page blaring. "Charlotte or Lilibet, who will inherit Diana's Spencer tiara?" News of the tiara had leaked, spreading like wildfire through dry fields. No one knew the source, perhaps a careless advisor, an eavesdropping servant, or a journalist too skilled at digging. But the consequences were clear. British and global media erupted. Articles dissected Charlotte and Lilibet, from Charlotte's poised appearance at the Chelsea Flower Show to rare photos of Lilibet playing in Montecito's garden. Online forums buzzed with debates. Charlotte is Diana's image. No, Lilibet embodies her free spirit. Hashtags like Team Charlotte and Team Lilibet trended, thrusting two girls into a battle they didn't know existed. Catherine traced her finger over the newspaper, her eyes sad. "How did it come to this, Aunt Anne?" she asked, her voice low, unable to hide her worry. "We only discussed possibilities, made no decisions. Now the world's weighing Charlotte and Lilibet against each other, like they're rivals." Anne crossed her arms, her gaze sharp but distant. "The press always turns everything into drama, Catherine. But this time we can't deny it. Someone deliberately leaked this. And that means someone wants to stir trouble." Catherine paused, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "You mean inside the royal circle? But who? Camilla, an advisor?" Anne shook her head, her voice low. "I don't know, but I'll find out. For now, we must focus on Charlotte. She'll soon feel this pressure, and you, as her mother, need to prepare her." Catherine nodded, her heart heavy. She thought of Charlotte playing with George and Louis in the next room, her laughter ringing through the door. How could she explain to her daughter that the world was comparing her to a cousin she barely knew? How could she shield her from Diana's shadow when even she felt its weight? Meanwhile, at Althorp, Earl Charles Spencer sat in his study, his gaze fixed on the Spencer tiara in its ebony box. Its diamonds sparkled, but they brought no joy, only painful memories of Diana. Charles had spent weeks pondering William and Anne's proposal, weighing the meaning of passing the tiara to Charlotte. But now, with the news plastered across papers, he felt betrayed. Someone had turned a private family discussion into a public spectacle, and it enraged him. The phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Charles frowned at Harry's number. He took a deep breath, bracing for a difficult talk. "Harry," he answered, his voice low and cold. "I assume you're calling about the tiara?" On the other end, Harry's voice was tense, laced with anger. "Uncle Charles, why did you let this get so out of hand? I just read the papers. The whole world's talking about Charlotte and Lilibet, like they're fighting over Mum's legacy. You promised to keep this quiet, but now what, you're giving the tiara to Charlotte without even asking me?" Charles's grip tightened, his simmering anger flaring. "You dare suggest I leaked this?" He snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. "Harry, I haven't said a word to the press. I haven't even decided what to do with the tiara. But you called to challenge me to defend Lilibet, as if Charlotte isn't worthy. Have you considered both girls are Diana's granddaughters?" Harry's breathing was ragged, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not saying Charlotte isn't worthy, but Lilibet's my daughter, and she carries Mum's name. If the tiara is Mum's legacy, Lilibet has a right to it too. Why does no one think of her? Why is it always about the royals and Charlotte?" Charles stood pacing to the window, his eyes lost in Althorp's fog-draped fields. He felt a familiar pain, the pain of watching Diana struggle, and now the pain of seeing her grandchildren divided by her legacy. "Harry," he said, his voice low but weighty. "You talk of rights, but do you truly understand this tiara's meaning? It's not a trinket to fight over. It's a symbol of what Diana sacrificed, what she fought for. You want it for Lilibet, but do you think she needs it to prove she's Diana's granddaughter? Or are you just grasping for a piece of your mother to soothe your own pain?" Charles's words hit like a blow, silencing Harry. In Montecito, he sat in his office, clutching the phone, his eyes on a photo of Diana. He wanted to argue, to say he was only protecting Lilibet, but deep down he knew Charles was partly right. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter, he was fighting to prove he, Harry, still belonged in his mother's story. Charles continued, his voice now tinged with sadness. "Harry, I see Diana in both Charlotte and Lilibet. But this tiara is tearing you apart, William, you and those girls. I won't let that happen. I'm keeping the tiara." Harry took a deep breath, his voice hoarse. "You think holding on to it will fix this? The press won't stop. They'll keep comparing, keep digging." "Then let them dig," Charles replied, his voice firm. "But I won't let this tiara become a weapon. And Harry, ask yourself, what do you really want? A piece of jewelry or a family not divided by material things?" The call ended in silence. No farewells, only the weight of unresolved issues. Charles sat touching the tiara, his eyes heavy with sorrow. He thought of Diana, her smile, and the promise he'd made to protect her grandchildren. But now he realized the tiara meant to symbolize love was becoming a curse. Rain pattered softly outside Kensington Palace, a gentle rhythm as if soothing the tension that had gripped William's family for weeks. In the cozy sitting room, the fireplace's glow danced on the walls, illuminating family photos. William and Catherine on their wedding day, George and Charlotte playing in the garden, Louis, with his mischievous grin. But tonight the space held an unusual stillness, as if the family were seeking lost moments of peace. Charlotte, in rabbit-printed pajamas, sat cross-legged on the rug, clutching her favorite teddy bear. George and Louis were asleep, leaving her with her parents. William sat in an armchair, a book open in his hands, but his eyes distant, lost in unspoken thoughts. Catherine nearby knitted a scarf, a rare habit from days before press scrutiny. But her stitches were slow, uneven, her mind elsewhere. Charlotte watched her parents, her wide eyes tinged with sadness. She sensed the change in their home, though she didn't grasp why. Her father no longer told silly jokes, her mother no longer sang lullabies while brushing her hair. Dinners were quiet, punctuated by worried glances between her parents. She knew nothing of the Spencer tiara, the headlines, or the tense calls between her father and Uncle Harry. But she knew one thing: her family wasn't happy. "Mummy, Daddy," Charlotte said, her voice clear but soft, as if afraid to break the fragile air. "I miss when you laughed more. Like when we went to the beach and Daddy lost his sandal to the waves and Mummy laughed till she cried. Why aren't you happy anymore?" Her words were a pebble dropped in a still pond, ripples spreading through the room. William froze, his book closing with a soft thud. Catherine stopped knitting, her hands trembling, her eyes turning to her daughter with love and regret. They looked at Charlotte, her tousled blonde hair, her earnest eyes as if she'd voiced what they had avoided. William knelt before her, his hand gently on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice warm but low. "I'm sorry. Mummy and we've been worried about some things. But you're right. I've forgotten those moments when we were just us." Catherine joined them, pulling Charlotte into her arms. "I'm sorry too, my love," she whispered, stroking her hair. "I don't want you to be sad. I just want to keep you, the happy girl I adore." Charlotte leaned into her mother, her voice tiny but resolute. "I don't need much. I just want you to be happy like before. How can I make you happy again?" Her innocent question pierced the fog in William's heart. He looked at his daughter, her sincerity shining, and suddenly the pressures, the tiara, the headlines, the rift with Harry seemed insignificant. Charlotte, despite the world's expectations, despite comparisons to her grandmother, was still a child who wanted her parents to smile. William smiled, the first time in weeks it reached his eyes. "You know you've already made me happy," he said, winking, "and I promise we'll have more days like the beach. Maybe I'll lose another sandal just to make Mummy laugh." Charlotte giggled, her laugh like silver bells, and Catherine couldn't hold back her own smile. She hugged her daughter tightly, a weight lifting from her heart. In that moment, they weren't the Prince and Princess of Wales, nor bearers of Diana's legacy. They were Charlotte's parents, and that was enough. That morning, a letter from Earl Charles Spencer arrived at Kensington Palace. In it, Charles wrote concisely but firmly he would keep the Spencer tiara, giving it to neither Charlotte nor Lilibet. He explained that the tiara, though Diana's symbol, had become a source of division, and he didn't want his sister's legacy to hurt her grandchildren. He hoped William and Harry would understand and prioritize their children's happiness above all. William read the letter in his office, Catherine beside him, her hand lightly on his shoulder. "He's right," she said softly. "The tiara isn't worth losing each other. Charlotte and Lilibet, they need to be themselves, not anyone's heir." William nodded, his eyes reflecting rare relief. "I agree. And I think Mum would want that too. She always wanted us to be free to be happy." They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They resolved not to pressure Charlotte to keep her from the world's expectations. When she was older, Charlotte would choose her path, perhaps the tiara, perhaps a different life. But it would be her choice, no one else's. Days later, at a charity event at Buckingham Palace, Charlotte stood on the balcony beside her parents and grandfather, King Charles. The crowd below cheered Union Jacks waving in the breeze. Charlotte, in a pale blue dress, waved with a gentle smile, her eyes holding unmistakable strength. She knew nothing of the tiara, the disputes, or the headlines. She only knew her parents were smiling. Her family was together, and she wanted to do something good, like the grandmother she knew through stories. The media continued writing about her Lilibet and Diana. But on that balcony, Charlotte stood not as a symbol, but as a girl with a new flame kindled in her heart. No one knew what she'd choose in the future, the tiara, or a path entirely her own. But one thing was clear. A new light had emerged in the royal family, and its name was Charlotte. Like, share and subscribe to stay tuned for more captivating stories.